I'm Rob Port with SayAnythingBlog.com, and I'm here with Shane Goettle. Shane was a part of an organization, and it was the Brighter Future Committee. Am I getting that right, Shane? Was that the?
Well, actually, to clarify that, there were actually three different entities that we're working with. And I know that may be a little confusing, but because of various federal rules, we had to have different entities for different purposes. One of them was the Brighter Future Alliance. A second was the Brighter Future Fund, and the third was the Brighter Future Committee.
And as part of one of those, your effort was to organize some of the voters out west, let them know about the opportunities to cast their ballots here in North Dakota, which I thought was an important thing to do. Obviously, energy issues are a major part of a major bone of contention in terms of policy, both in North Dakota and nationally. There's a lot of people with a lot of different views on how we should be developing energy here in the United States, and the people who work in the industry that develops that energy should vote and should have a say at the polls. And I thought that was very important. And you were involved in that. Can you kind of describe some of the things that you were doing out west to organize those votes?
Well, sure. The first thing that I would say is, after my bid for Congress, I decided to set up my own super PAC. That's a political entity. It spends independent expenditures on behalf of clients. It was focused on the federal races. So the Brighter Future Fund was my super PAC. Brighter Future Committee was a separate super PAC. The first one accepted both individual and corporate contributions. That was the fund. The committee only accepted individual contributions, and I can get into that, why we did it that way in a moment. But the other entity, the Alliance, was one that was set up for an entirely different purpose, really a non-political purpose in a sense. It was set up to educate voters on how to vote in North Dakota. And with all the newcomers that we have here, there is a demand on the part of their employers to get out good, solid information on how to vote. Now, that was done in a really kind of a nonpartisan way. Through that entity, the materials we produced, that we put in the hands of employers, or the workshops that we offered to present, were simply done as educational efforts. It was a nonprofit entity. It's a 501c4, and so it's a little less political in its nature in that sense. And so what we did is produced materials that didn't tell any voter how to vote, which party to vote for, or anything like that. It's just simply, how do you vote in North Dakota? And our big effort there was to educate them on how to vote by absentee ballot, as well as what they need with them if they show up at the polls to vote. And so, as you mentioned, I think that's critical. And it's up to the candidates, in a sense, to make the final appeal to these voters and win them over. And I don't think we should make the mistake that they're one-issue voters either. They're certainly concerned about energy. They're certainly concerned about movement to oppose fracking and the technology involved with horizontal drilling. But they have complex lives just like the rest of us. And
right.
So I do think that we need to understand that when we're trying to appeal to them as candidates or potential candidates. But their livelihood, they're here because they found a good job. They found a good job with good pay, the one that can support themselves, and many of them have families that they're moving here. So we wanted to make sure they understood, yes, you can vote in North Dakota if you meet our requirements. And again, that's, if you're living and working here and you're 18 years of age, U.S. citizen, you've been in a precinct for 30 days, you can vote here. What we found, of course, is that we had to be very clear in all our materials. You can only vote in one state. So if you're a proud Texan and you're going to vote in Texas, you cannot vote in North Dakota. However, if you vote in North Dakota, we welcome you. You're a new resident, new citizen here. Welcome to our state, and here's how you vote. That was kind of our message.
And I think that was a good one. And obviously, that was a message, and that you wanted to push and to get those people to vote. And I think we both agree that, it's important that the people who work in that industry have a say. And I think, from the Republican side of things, and I know that wasn't necessarily, your objective. You're just trying to tell these people how to vote. But I think a lot of race observers like myself we're watching the race, and we're really expecting the oil vote to have a big impact and to change a lot of the dynamics in the North Dakota electorate. And it doesn't really seem like that happened. Like it doesn't seem like the oil patch turnout vote was there.
Yeah, I can see why you might say that when you look at the 2008 election, the presidential elections, and you compare the number of votes. It didn't seem like there was a lot of difference. But we dug underneath those numbers, Rob. There were in what I would call the oil and gas producing counties, and there's largely 17, 18 of those.
Let me before you get into that, I want to read out some of the numbers that I ran, because I do want to hear, because I just right after the election, I kind of took just a quick look. I went through and all the members of the North Dakota Association of Oil Producing Counties. I went through, counted up their votes, compared them to the 2008 turnout. And the number that I got was that there were just 2,884 more votes. So that's the numbers that you're talking about now.
It is. And so we're talking about the same numbers. But if you look underneath those numbers, we looked at some of the data. In 2012, there was an impressive 31,000 requests, 31,414 to be exact, out of those counties you just mentioned, requests for absentee ballots, and 29,281 to be exact actually turned around and submitted ballots. Those numbers are up substantially from the previous two elections. So in 2010, for example, there were 8,000, just over 8. Well, actually, more than that. Trumps the 2010 number by 8,008. The number of people who voted by absentee, and it trumps the 2010 number by 11,545. So there were a lot more absentee ballot applications submitted in this election than there were in the previous two elections. And then in a number of counties, it's also true that they actually had more voters showing up at the polls than in the previous two elections. That's true in Billings County, for example. That's true in Burke County. It was true in Mount Trail County. True in Williams County. So, and in all of those cases, they had both more absentee ballot applications as well as more people showing up at the polls. And in the 2012 election cycle, there's about 10,000, over 10,000 new voters that were added. So here's my analysis. I think they did turn out to vote. Maybe not as heavy as what we might have expected, but I think they were there. And I also think that we've lost some of our base, and that was true statewide, at least in the Berg election, that a number of even self-identified Republicans jumped and voted for Heidi. She had a very impressive ground game, and I think we got to give her credit for getting her vote to turn out. And I think there's some evidence that the voter turnout in the Berg race wasn't as powerful as the Heitkamp race. Berg, for example, lost Divide County. Well, there aren't as many oil and gas workers housed in Divide County as in some of these other counties that we've talked about. So I think what's happened in part is the oil and gas workers did turn up to vote. What we lost is what we would consider to be some of our Republican base in the process.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that turnout was actually down statewide. We actually the total number of ballots cast was up slightly, but the total number of ballots cast in the context of people who are eligible to cast a vote, turnout was down about 4%. So what do you think is explaining that? Because obviously, and I'm comparing that to 2008, which was the last presidential election. Why is turnout down from 2008 to 2012 in North Dakota?
I think part of it is this. In 2008, it's a presidential election at the top that really generates a good deal of turnout, and there, of course, McCain won the state. I think people turned out for that election, and for whatever reason, they tended to stay home this time. Maybe it's because things are going so well in North Dakota. In 2008, I think that was a little less apparent. We were just getting into the oil and gas drilling at that point, and now things are going well. And when people sometimes when they vote their pocketbook, they just vote to stay home because they're content. And there may be that. I don't know that it was, and maybe I've heard this in some quarters that in a way, Heitkamp is much more personal a candidate than Rick Berg. I think that's one thing he was probably handicapped with. I know him and I like him.
Yeah.
But I think Heidi tends to have a reputation of being the more personal candidate, and so I think he lost some Republicans, particularly in Fargo. I mean, that was obvious. He had a 10,000 vote deficit in Fargo, and even with all the newcomers in the West, and him running up some very strong numbers in some of those western states, that's just not enough. Western counties, I should say. That's just not enough to overcome the deficit in Fargo. I think we lost some Republicans in the eastern part of the state. That's evident in that race anyway. But at the same time, Kevin Cramer won places like Grand Forks County and ran a very positive and strong campaign. So it's not impossible for Republicans to...
a very outspoken campaign, I would say. I mean, it's surprising. He wins Grand Forks County. He came out, he took a very conservative position on wind power subsidies. And as a matter of fact, during the campaign, a wind power, a company involved in the wind industry, shut its doors and was going to have to be laying off, a few hundred workers in Grand Forks County, and he still wins despite that. So it almost doesn't seem like it's not even so much an issues thing, because Cramer ran a very conservative campaign and won in places where Berg didn't.
He did, but note this: Kevin's lead was so substantial that he never had to go negative in his campaign. He ran a very positive campaign.
Yeah.
With all the negativity going back and forth, both between Heitkamp and Berg and some of the other entities that were in here, I think that turns people off. I mean, it has its effect, it has its power, but it also turns people away. And they always have to strike this right balance. How negative can you go in a campaign?
Yeah.
Before you really start losing more than you're gaining. And nobody really knows that until the end. The other thing that is striking is the polls. The polls, of course, all showed Berg having a pretty comfortable margin. And I think when you're not, all across the Republican side of things, there was no perception that we had close races other than maybe Baszler and Chrisman. And the Berg race was not perceived to be close. Well, I think that made Heidi appear to be the underdog, and really allowed her to rally her.
Yeah, she exploited her
folks to the polls. And maybe people didn't see the urgency in the Berg race as much as they did in the Heitkamp race to get the vote out. So,
there was, speaking to that, there was a roll call reporter posted on Twitter earlier this week that she'd had reports from two sources that the Berg campaign had internal polling that showed them up as much as 6 points, which jived with some of the public polling that we'd seen that was showing leads, anywhere from the 10 points that the Fargo Forum poll was showing to Rasmussen, which has a pretty good track record for polling here in North Dakota, showed him with a 5-point lead. So the polls just were wrong, I guess.
Yeah, well, and here's a lesson for Republicans. You can't lose Fargo by 10,000 votes and expect to make it up in other parts of the state.
Yeah.
If that's only by 5,000 votes, he'd be our senator.
I agree with that, and that's something I was actually, and it brings me back sort of why I wanted to talk to you is I was actually thinking that the oil patch vote might have changed that dynamic, like maybe because of all the growth we've seen, and not just the oil workers, but all the other people. I mean, there's a lot of people moving in to Western North Dakota, not just to work in the oil patch, but because of all the economic activity going out there. I expected, the population growth in Western North Dakota to have changed the the makeup of the electoral the electorate, insofar as you wouldn't necessarily need to state that Red River Valley wouldn't be do or die, as it usually is in state politics. And I think that still may come to be. I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I think we're maturing toward that route.
Yeah.
I think what we see right now is a lot of hustle and bustle going on in the West, and it is difficult to get some of these folks who are just working very long hours. They're getting great pay, but they're also working very long hours, and they're working hard, and they're tired. and to really get them to get a sense of North Dakota politics, I think when they're new here is a tough thing to try to achieve, and I think that will happen over time as they settle in, as more and more families come up here. We were out in even some of the RV parks, and I had the opportunity to talk to some of the folks that were living there when they were home, and I saw in several cases that whole families are, a spouse and a couple kids, bikes outside. I mean, I can't say that's happening in great numbers, but it is happening. And so whole families are coming here, and even in some of the temporary housing, they're finding ways to do that. And as these guys look around, and as more housing gets developed out west, as they bring their families here, they'll get more involved in their communities. And I think it's really that community involvement that transforms them into long-lasting constituents that have something to say and have a stake in the future. And that's when people really start voting, I think, in greater numbers. So I think we're maturing to that. But that having been said, I do think that they did turn out, and that we can see that mainly in the absentee ballot numbers, because that was our push. We knew these guys were busy, and we said, look, the easiest way for you to vote in North Dakota is to vote by absentee. Make sure that you're affirming everything is true with regard to your age and your citizenship and your that you've lived in a precinct for 30 days. But that's what it takes to vote here. And only vote in one state, but if you vote here, this is how you need to do it. And I do think they showed up in the absentee ballots. I think many of them just showed up at the polls. I have heard anecdotally that there were long lines at some polling places out west, that precisely because people were filling out affidavits, because that was what they had to do, and they don't have a North Dakota driver's license or a utility bill to validate where they're living, and a lot of these guys don't have that. So the only way for them to vote and affirm that they meet the requirements is to do that by affidavit, and that did cause some long lines in places that weren't prepared for the sheer volume of that. So that's anecdotal, but I would say that what we were challenged with across the state is the base vote, the people who have lived here for a long time, and getting them to vote too. And when you couple both the new workers and that base vote, then I think you can really get some good, strong turnout numbers that should show up across the election cycles that you and I began this conversation with. So.
Sure. Shane, last question. You ran for the U.S. House this cycle, didn't win the nomination at the convention. I know you're working for Odney now and seeming to be pretty happy doing that, but any chance you would take another shot at elected office in North Dakota?
Yes, I think so. And I don't know what that might be down the road. I mean, I'm not one of those guys that has to run for office to affirm my identity, Rob. I'm Shane Goettle, and I've got a family, and I can make a great career in the private sector. I've been there before. I can do it again. And right now, Rob, I've passed on some of that for the time being because number one, I've wanted to get my feet on the ground here. Number two, we've got a family gravel company that we've been trying to build, and that's taken some time too. And I wanted to devote myself to the time that would require to do that. So I'm young in terms of political careers. I'm 43, but I remain very interested in public service, and may take a crack at it again down the road. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
You bet. Thanks, Rob.